Hey, it's your tutor Courtney Waterman, lover of anime, manga, and math. And this is another session of Tutor Me Senpai. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Courtney, and this is another session of Tutor Me Senpai. Today, we're going to be getting into 10th grade factoring quadratic equations. Now, quadratic equations have a few different ways you can factor them, but today we're going to go through some really basic ones. I'll probably make another video showing more ways on tackling different versions of quadratics, but that's for another day. So for today, we're going to go strictly on the basics, and we're also going to be looking at the FOIL method. If you've never heard of the FOIL method, I'll introduce it in a little bit. So let's dive into our first question. Before we get started though, I'm going to do something a little bit different. Instead of having the question appear on the screen and then go away, I'm going to try to put it right about here. So you can kind of see what question we're going to be working with the entire time. So the first question says, x squared plus 2x minus 24, all right? And remember, we're going to talk about the FOIL method. The FOIL method being first, outer, inner, last. So write that here. First, outer, inner, last. And that is looking at whenever we have our factors and we're multiplying or distributing out, we want to focus on the first position. So if it's looking like this, the first position is this for both of them, right? So we're going to multiply these. So you're going to get the A times C times x squared. And we're going to add it to the outer, which this is the outer, and that's the outer. So we're going to multiply by these. It's ax times d. So what you get, adx. Multiply by the inner, which is going to be this. Sorry, add it to the inner. And then finally your last, which is going to be this. So you're adding up all these products, right? And then once you simplify that, you'll get your expanded version of this multiplication here, okay? So we're going to use this, we're going to tap into this to not only check our work, but to kind of see why we do some things that we do when we factor, all right? So try to keep in mind FOIL, first, outer, inner, last. All right, we'll do it again as we're checking our work. So whenever we're wanting to factor quadratics, we have to look at their coefficients, all right? Their coefficients and their signs of the coefficients are very, very important, right? We have to look at them and take note of what they are so that we know how best to tackle this question. So the coefficients we have here are 1, 2, and a negative 24. If this was anything but 1, we would have to tackle it a different way. But don't worry, that'll be our next question. Since it is 1, we can ignore that for now. The next thing we want to look at is this coefficient, right? Now, how I like to start with my factoring, I know they're going to be 2 sets of parentheses. I know that. You know, when we're factoring quadratics, they're going to be 2 sets of parentheses here. All right. And since there's no coefficient in front of this x squared, I know that each of these is going to get their own x. Okay. So when you have 1, so when I say no coefficient, I mean there's an understood 1. There's no coefficient different from 1. You can start off this way. Each parentheses is going to get their own x. Okay? And then we look at this. Because we're going to have to put some kind of signs here. Plus or minus, whatever they are. We're going to have to put some type of signs here. And we're going to have to put some number here. Right? So how do we figure out what number to put here? And what sign belongs to them? Well, that's where this 24 comes in. The last coefficient in our quadratic lets us know exactly what numbers and their signs go here. So the first thing we do here is find out the factors of negative 24. Because whatever the factors are, the ones that work for our situation will end up here. So the first thing is figure out what all the factors are. And then we'll go into our second part. So the factors of 24 are 1 and 24, 2 and 12, 3 and 8, 4 and 6. Now this is a negative 24. So it means one of these has to be positive and the other has to be negative when we multiply it in order to get this negative 24. So I'm going to write my notation like this. If this is going to be positive, then this is going to be negative. If this is going to be negative, this is going to be positive. In order to preserve my negative 24. So I'll do that for all of these. So you see, for this 2, if it's positive, the 12 is negative. For this 3, if it's negative, the 8 is positive. Okay? And like I said, that's very important because the order is going to matter when it ends up here. Whatever set works out for our second criteria is going to be here, and we have to make sure that their signs add up properly. Okay? So the first thing is figure out what are the factors of negative 24, or what are the factors of our last coefficient of our quadratic equation. So the next thing that we have to look at is, of these factors, when you multiply them together they give you this, but when you add them together or when you combine them, taking their signs into account, which one gives you this? All right? So you multiply them together, you get your negative 24 here, right? You're preserving the signs. But when you combine them using their signs, which one gives us this plus 2? All right? So let's say we were adding these across. Positive 1 with a negative 24. What are we going to get when we combine those? We're going to get a negative 23. How about this? Negative 1 with a plus a positive 24. We're going to get a positive 23. So we're going to keep this sign consistent with what we have here as well. All right? Likewise for here. Positive 2 minus a 12. You're going to get a negative 10. Negative 2 plus a 12. Positive 10. Okay? Now you're going to get this. Positive 3 minus an 8. You can get negative 5. Negative 3 plus an 8. Positive 5. And last but not least, positive 4, negative 6. You can get a minus 2. Negative 4 and a positive 6. Positive 2. So, of all the factors that when you multiply them together, you get negative 24, which pair of factors, including their sign, gives you positive 2 when you combine them? That's going to be this one here. 4, 6, but it's going to be a negative 4 and a positive 6. All right? So our two numbers are going to be negative 4 and positive 6 that we're going to throw into this. And when I say throw, I really mean just throw it. So you see, the negative 4 goes here, the positive 6 goes here. Because there are no there was no coefficient greater than 1 or different from 1 here, we don't have to necessarily pay attention to which set of parentheses they end up in. That's going to come a little bit later. Right now, we know that a -4 goes into one and a +6 goes into the other. So now we want to check our work. And we're going to check it using this FOIL method. Once again, first, outer, inner, last. All right? So when we multiply these two together, we get an x squared. So that's our first. When we multiply the outers together, we get a plus 6x. That's our O. When we multiply the inners, we get a negative 4x, right? And we multiply our last, we get a negative 24. And then when we simplify this, we realize that these are the only two that we can kind of do anything with. So we get x squared plus, with 6x minus 4x, 2x minus 24. Does this equal what we had when we began? Yes. So we know that all of our work is correct. Good job. Good job. I hope that was easy to follow. I know there was a lot of stuff going on. There was a lot to follow here. But don't worry, we have 2 more examples in which we're really going to be driving home the same kind of steps, okay? But we're going to take it a little step further because this was our first one. I try to start you off a little bit easier where we didn't have any coefficient to worry about here other than 1. But things are not always that easy, as you know from your tests. You sometimes get hit with slightly more difficult questions, so we're going to jump into one right now. So the next question is going to be 6x squared minus 48x plus 96. As you see, this time we do have a coefficient that's different from 1. So instead of diving straight in, we want to do one more step. And that step is seeing if all of our numbers have something in common. So when we look at this, we have a 6, we have a negative 48, and we have a 96. Is there a number that's common, or what is the greatest common factor of all of these 3 coefficients? I'll give you a little hint. It's underlined. Yes, 6 is common for all of them, right? 6 can go into itself, 6 can go into 48, and 6 can go into 96. So when we factor out 6, we will simplify our quadratic a ton. So the first thing you want to do, if you see that all the coefficients have something in common that you can factor out, you're going to want to do that. So like factoring this out, we get x squared, right? And when you factor out a 6 from 48, you're left with, or negative 48, you're left with 8x, right? And when you factor out a 6 from this 96, you're left with 16. So we have 6 on the outside, and we have our new quadratic equation that we're going to factor. And that is x squared minus 8x plus 16. So while this is on the outside, we can almost ignore it, but we're going to have to make sure that we're keeping track of it just to bring it down with the rest of the work, because this 6 is still part of our factoring. All right? So if you remember our steps from last time, we're going to want to find all the factors of this 16. And although I didn't include it in my circle, we want to include that positive as well, because the sign is very important. So we have a positive 16 here. Now, what are the factors of 16? We know that when you multiply 1 and 16, you get 16, right? 2 and 8, you get 16. 4 and 4, you get 16. So when we look at these factors and we see that this is a positive, what are the possibilities for the signs now? Well, if this is positive, that means this is positive. If this is negative, that means this is negative. Notice I'm preserving the signs in the fashion of when I multiply, I'm preserving this positive. Likewise here, if that's positive, this is positive. This is negative, that's negative. This is positive, this is positive. This is negative, that's negative. All right, so now that we found the factors of 16, we can now look at the second step. Of these factors, which one gives us a -8 when we combine them? All right, so when you combine two positive numbers, do you get a negative? No. So that means we can effectively ignore the tops of all of these. All right? So when you combine -1 and -16, you get -17. When you combine a -2 and a -8, you get -10. And when you combine a -4 and -4, you get -8. So of the pairs, which one, when you combine them, taking their signs into account, do you get -8? This last one. Right? So now we know the two factors that when we multiply them together gives us a +16, but when we combine them, adding them together, we get a -8. That's going to be our -4 and -4. It's okay to have the same one twice. It's a double factor, okay? So we're going to drag down this 6. Make sure we're keeping that 6 there. And remember, a quadratic is going to have two sets of parentheses. There's no longer a coefficient other than 1 here, so both of these are going to get their own x, right? And we know that both of these are going to end up here. Because they're both the same, it really doesn't matter where you put it. So our final answer is 6 times x minus 4 times x minus 4. Or you can write it like this. 6 times x minus 4, in which x minus 4 is squared because you have two of them. When you multiply the same thing, you're just squaring it. So we can simplify our factoring by just saying 6 times x minus 4 squared. So that's going to be the answer for this. But let's check our work. Let's make sure, all right? We want to do our FOIL, all right? So let's FOIL this first, and then we'll multiply the 6 out. So I'm going to put these in brackets so we can just focus on what's inside the brackets. So the first thing we want to do is look at the first part of each set of parentheses. And when we multiply those together, we get x squared. Now we look at the outer, right? First, outer. So the outer parts are going to be this x and this -4. When we multiply those together, we get a -4x. Then we're going to look at the inner, which is going to be a -4 and an x. Multiply those together, we get another -4x. And then we look at last. -4 and a -4. We multiply those together, we get a +16. And if we simplify this out a little bit more, we get -8x plus 16. X squared minus 8x plus 16. If this equals that, we're done. Does it? No. Because we didn't do anything with our 6. Remember, I didn't want you to forget it. We've been dragging it down, but we're going to have to do that a little bit more, right? So this is the same thing as this, which is the same thing as this. So this 6 is going to come down here, and then it's going to come down here. And then finally, let's distribute this 6 to everything. 6 times x squared is 6x squared. 6 times a -8 is a -48. And then 6 times a +16 is a +96. So you're left with 6x squared minus 48x plus 96. Now, if this equals what we have up top, then we're done. Does it? Yes. So that means that the work that we did here pans out when we do our FOIL method to re-expand it. Instead of factoring it, we've expanded it back and we get the same thing. So we are good to go. Great job. Great job. So I hope you're able to follow along. Here's just one more question to show just another side of these quadratics. Don't freak out. We're going to do our same steps, but we're going to see how maybe in some situations, not all the steps are going to be available to us. So we're going to have to think of ways to kind of tackle our new question using what we already know how to do. So our last question is going to be 8x squared plus 2x minus 3. So if you remember the question we just did, it also had a coefficient that was different from 1. But unlike that question, we don't have a factor that's common amongst these three. So there will be no factoring out the greatest common factor. We have to be stuck with what we have here. So we're going to put our parentheses because it's still a quadratic, but we're going to hold off on putting our x's just yet because we have another step we have to do because this 8 is here. So we'll start with this. Let's find our factors of negative 3. 3 will equal 1 times 3. So when this is positive, this is a negative 3. When this is positive, this is a negative. And when this is negative, this is a positive. Right? But not only that, we have to find our factors of 8, which is going to be 1 times 8 and 2 times 4. Because this is positive, we can effectively just look at the positive versions. It's our leading coefficient and it's positive, so let's not bother with the negative. It's going to make things a lot more complicated and it doesn't add anything to it. If this were negative, we would have to account for the negative, but because this is positive, it's a luxury we are afforded. So we're going to focus on the positive versions of these, and then we're going to fill in our sets of parentheses a few different times to see which one works best. So we have 8 here and a 1 here, and we're going to give each one an x. And then we're going to look at our factors here to see which one works best. So we have a plus 1 and a negative 3, right? And then we have the same 8x, in which we can switch the signs, negative 1, positive 3. But we also have the ability to not only switch the signs, but switch the numbers. Because these x's aren't the same, here's an 8x and here's a 1x, we have to now worry about which location are we putting our factors. So this 8x can be tied to the 1, or it can be tied to the 3. As such. And you have another one. So if we just look at this combined with this, we get these 4 scenarios. We're going to do the same thing for this bottom one now. So our sets of parentheses are going to say 2, 4, give both of them x, and we're going to hit the same exact one. So plus 1, minus 3, 2x, minus 1, 4x, plus 3, 2x, plus 3, 4x, minus 1, 2x, minus 3, 4x, plus 1. Now that we have all possible combinations, we want to see which one, when we use our FOIL method, gives us this here. Now for this, you don't have to use the full FOIL method. We're only focusing on the outer and the inner portion because we already know that from our factors here, when we multiply the first or we multiply the last, we're going to get those numbers. But we have to figure out how to get this positive 2x. So we're going to focus only on the outer and the inner portion of the FOIL method. So I'm going to number these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So when we look at 1 and we look at the outer, we look at these. So 8x times negative 3, that gives you a negative 24x. And the inner is this plus x. When we add that together, do you get a plus 2x? No. This is way too big and it's way too negative to give us a positive 2x. So 1 doesn't work. Let's look at the next one. That's going to be a 8x times a positive 3. So you're going to get a positive 24x minus x. Does that give us a positive 2x? No. Although this is very positive, it's way too big. And we're not going to get that 2 anytime soon. So 2 doesn't work. How about 3? 8x times negative 1. So we get a negative 8x plus 3x. So negative 8x plus 3x, it's too negative and too big to give us this 2x. So 3 is not going to work either. How about 4? That's positive 8x minus 3x. Now it's the correct sign, but this gives us a 5x, which is still too big for our question. So 4 is not going to work either. So we've effectively crossed out all 4 of these. Now let's look at these. Let's look at number 5. All right. So remember, we're still looking at the outer and the inner portions of FOIL. So the outer portion tells us we have a negative 6x, and the inner portion tells us we have a positive 4x. Now when you combine those together, you get a negative 2x. Is that what we were looking for? No. We want a positive 2x, so 5 is not the one. How about 6? So now we have 2x times 3, which gives us a positive 6x, minus 1 times 4x, which gives us negative 4x. When we combine those, we get a positive 2x. And that's exactly what we're looking for. So this is a candidate. Are any of these other ones candidates? Let's check very quickly. So we have 7, 2 times negative 1, so negative 2x. 4x times 3, so that's 12x. Way, way too big. So 7 is not a candidate. How about 8? 2x times 1x, so you get a positive 2x. Negative 3 times 4x, negative 12x. Way too negative. So 8 is also not a candidate. Normally you can stop when you find one, but I just wanted you to see that this is the only one that's going to work. So we're going to erase this and then finish up our question with the full FOIL to make sure that everything works out exactly how we're expecting it. So our answer is 2x minus 1, 4x plus 3. And when we full FOIL this, first, so that's 8x outer plus 6x inner, negative 4x last, negative 3. So that's 8x. We combine this to get positive 2x minus 3. And this is the same thing as up here. So we know that all of our work checks out. So that concludes another session of Tutor Me Senpai. Today we did 10th grade factoring quadratic equations. If anything was confusing, I challenge you to watch it again. Go really slow because that was a lot of information we went through. And factoring comes in a lot of different flavors. So I don't want you to panic if what we talked about today doesn't cover your situation. There are plenty other ones and I hope to cover them in a future video. If this video was helpful in any way, I still want you to watch it again because math needs a lot of practice. And the more you practice, the better you'll be. And when we're ready to dive into those more difficult ones, you've already built a good base for it. So as we wrap up, if there were any questions that you had as we were going over our questions, I want you to put them in the comments. I want to read them, and if I can get you an answer, I want to do my best to do so. If you like this and you want more videos like this, and especially if you're looking forward to my next video on this topic, why don't you hit that subscribe button, hit that notification bell so you know exactly when it drops, and make sure you like this video. Share it with a friend, or even put in your favorite so you can refer to it whenever you need it. I'm Courtney, and this is another session of Tutor Me Senpai. See you next session.